Hello, everybody. It's Scott Drury. I want to mention a few things about Kensinger and Schacter, Garry and Gerrie, and the second part of Schacter, which is the same Schacter, by the way, uh, from 2001, part 2. So that's the easiest one by far, and I'm just going to mention that briefly. But the other two are heavily empirical. They involve elaborate experiments, and I do want to touch on those. And these are important, particularly with respect to the quizzes that you'll take, for what that's worth. I hope you intend to do well on the quizzes, of course. I want to refer you to an event that happened 12 years ago. And some of you are young, and 12 years ago was a long time, and you just may not have been paying attention to baseball 12 years ago. But there was an extraordinary situation that happened between the Yankees and the Red Sox, who coincidentally are playing each other right as I'm recording this. They had a weekend series in New York. But the bottom line is, these two teams were competing in a 7-game series to go to the World Series in 2004, what is called the American League Championship Series. And the way it works is that it's essentially the first team to win 4 games, and they call it best of 7. It had never happened before, or maybe just one other time, where a team got down 3 games to none and rallied to win 4 straight games to advance or to win the World Series. It's something that's just the rarest of happenings. Maybe 3 times in all of the major professional sports like hockey, basketball, and baseball that use a multi-game playoff. Well, it happened in 2004. The Red Sox got down 3 games to none, and they lost decisively. And in fact, what you see there on the left, with Derek Jeter exclaiming happily as they lost Game 3, 19-8, and were in line to go to the 2004 World Series because they were winning at that point 3 games to none over the Red Sox. Well, over the next 4 games, of course, the Red Sox won every game, including Game 7 at Yankee Stadium. So it was just a shocking turn of events. And what had made it even more emotional is that the Yankees had absolutely dominated the Red Sox for, 25, 30 years prior to that. And indeed, the Red Sox had not won a World Series since the 20s. So it was very emotional for the Red Sox, who indeed did go on to beat, who did they beat that year? The Cardinals, yeah. They went on to sweep the Cardinals in the World Series, so that the Red Sox actually won 8 straight games. I don't want to belabor baseball. I know many of you are not sports fans, but it was remarkable for even the most casual sports fan that any team can come back from 3-0. What this offered, given the intensity of sports following in the Northeast, New England and New York, was an opportunity. And the opportunity was to look at how people formed memories of the event, of the 7-game World Series, depending on whom they were pulling for, whether they were a Yankees fan or a Red Sox fan. Both of which, of course, are major markets, gigantic sports markets. And actually, if you ever look at a map, Boston's actually north of New York. So this is one of those cases where we look at how memories are formed and the accuracy of those memories for both negative and positive memories, which is harder to do. Normally, we have great availability for negative memories. For instance, where were you on September 11th? Where was a person that was of age on the day President Kennedy was killed, etc.? The first space shuttle disaster in January of '86. Those are all horrible things, but from the perspective of Boston Red Sox fans, this is a very, very positive thing. So, and again, I'll try not to bore you too much with the details of the sporting event. I know not everybody follows baseball. It's just not your interest, but that's what made it so noteworthy, is this incredible comeback, which was nearly unprecedented. I think at that point in '04, it had only happened once in ice hockey in the late 70s. So here's the notion, and I want to touch on a few of their blurbs or their paragraphs that are pertinent to the case. Information associated with positive or negative affect is more likely to be remembered than anything lacking emotional importance, and usually that affect is negative. People tend to believe that they remember emotional experiences more vividly than non-emotional ones, akin to this idea of a flashbulb memory. And most flashbulb memories that people hold are for negative things, like 9/11. The things that you may have heard if you were of age on September 11th, 2001 were just quite jarring for most people. So, the results of studies demonstrated that people's memories for highly negative public events, like a September 11th, typically, oops, excuse me, I don't know what I just did with my elbow there. Yes, thank you. The results of these studies have demonstrated that people's memories for highly negative public events are associated with high vividness and confidence. I believe that I remember these things, although the details individuals recall are not always accurate. For instance, if you look me up when I'm 85, I hope I'll live that long, I may tell some stories about September 11th, 2001 that happened when I was 31 that are just inaccurate. I began to believe things that were said to me, or particular businesses or government offices were closed or whatnot, and that may not have been the case. But nonetheless, I hold it with a lot of confidence. However, the research results have not provided insight into whether these memory characteristics are the same for positive events. And frankly, it's harder to come up with highly positive events, and here's the idea. So this may be because individuals in a happy mood rely either on a gist-based information heuristics, whereas individuals in a negative mood are more likely to focus on specific details. So one of the things that the literature has found, and I think I just inadvertently deleted that slide, is that people that have negative memories are more accurate. They tend to adhere more to details, whereas people that have very positive memories are in a haze, in a sense, and get those things wrong. And that may be because individuals in a happy mood rely on gist-based information, the emotion. And the people that are going through a negative experience are more concrete in their impressions. So only a handful of studies have compared memories of a negative public event with memories of a positive event. And you can see those are here. And taken together, the results of those experiments are a bit inconclusive. So to our knowledge, only one prior study has examined the effects of positive versus negative valence on the vividness and the objective accuracy of adults' memories for public events. These two authors, Levine and Bluck, asked participants to determine whether or not particular events had occurred during the verdict around the O.J. Simpson trial, which, if memory serves, was October 1995 or so. And that would have been 9 years later, of course, that their author was published. Like Levine and Bluck, who spoke to people about O.J. Simpson's trial, in the present study, we examine memory for the same event, the final game of this 2004 Red Sox-Yankees playoff series, which would have happened, ballpark October 18th of 04, give or take. In participants who found the outcome to be highly positive, indeed miraculous, like the Red Sox fans, or extremely negative, the Yankees fans, their bewilderment was almost comical, or neutral, fans that couldn't care less, that weren't part of either team. And I would describe myself that way, but just the sheer noteworthiness of the Red Sox coming back was pretty interesting. So thus the present study was designed to address three goals. We assessed whether the amount of detail remembered about an emotional event is affected by the valence. So happy or sad, do you remember more detail? Second, we investigated whether the valence affects a memory's vividness, its consistency, or a person's confidence. So we've got the details, and then we got vividness, consistency, or confidence. And third, we examined whether the effect of valence on the memory differed for event-related and personal details. So quite a bit to do here, and I'm going to do my best to ignore the inferential stats that appear in the article, which are plentiful, but get to the gist. So we recruited participants who were strong Red Sox supporters, participants who were avid Yankees supporters, they should have used the same terminology, and participants who described themselves as neutral, like I was back then. No participants reported that they had a history with either team, is what it ultimately says. And here's the procedure. And it's fairly clever. This was right around the time of the game itself, the Game 7 that decided who was going to go to the World Series. Participants completed a survey that prompted them to recall the details they remembered about 3 events: Game 7 of that playoff series, one of the presidential debates, parenthetically, it was between Bush and Kerry that year, and a non-emotional event of their choosing, which could have been anything. Surveys were completed no more than 6 days after the game, so this would have been, golly, and then before November 1st of '04. And after a 23 to 27 week delay, which would have been roughly 6 months, of course. Time 1 surveys were scored for the quantity of information recalled. Time 2 surveys were scored for the quantity of information, the consistency compared to the first time, and the confidence and the vividness, how clear people reported it to be. So the quantity of recalled information, in other words, just the sheer volume of all the things they recall, quantity scores at time 1 and time 2 were calculated by tallying how many pieces of information they provided in response to all the event-related questions. Everything received a 0, half, or 1 point. A score of 0 was given when nothing was recalled, half point when some information, then a full point if a lot of information. So scoring was conducted by 2 research assistants, and the average of 2 scores was used in all analyses. So, and by the way, they would have 2 raters here. If we use just 1 rater, it might be the case that that rater of quantity recalled at time 1 was biased. Maybe that person just had an unusual way of looking at it. So by using more than 1 rater, and frankly 2 is atypical, it should have been 3 in my humble opinion, but nonetheless, to have at least 2 would be necessary in order to allay concerns about the person doing the rating having some kind of obscure way of looking at things. You never know. So, consistency. When the report on a piece of information was entirely different at time 1 than time 2, it got a 0. When it was recalled in a slightly different manner, it got, a half point. If the precise amount of detail was recalled at time 1 and time 2, 1 point was awarded. If participants provided additional information at time 2, this didn't impact consistency scores. So I'm looking and deciding, well, are they telling the same story 6 months later, which would have been roughly in May of 2005? And thus I can decide if that's true, etc. So also we had 2 raters doing that way. And I would be curious to hear the stories that people tell, both with respect to event-related and personal-related details. In other words, who I was sitting with, who was eating nachos at the time they won the game, etc. Assessments of confidence and vividness. For each question answered at time 2, participants were asked to rate their confidence in the response on a 1 to 5 scale. We computed an average confidence for responses to event-related details and for personal details, in other words, particulars about what happened, who you were with, etc. Then they reported vividness on a 1 to 7 scale. In other words, how clear do you think these memories are? It's an involved method, I'll grant you. But, of course, everything that I'm talking about here is available for your inspection as you follow along with your article. So, interestingly, intensity ratings did not significantly differ between those who found it positive and those who found it negative. The non-emotional group, which was the neutral group, and again, they frustrate me when they don't use the same terms. The neutral group rated the event as less intense than either of the other groups whose team won or whose team lost. If you didn't care, you found it to be less intense. The positive and negative groups also did not differ in their ratings for personal importance of the event, surprise, or number of emotions generated, etc. So, anyway, that's pretty self-explanatory. Here are some other results. Now, do know that this is littered with, and it can't be avoided, I couldn't separate it very much, inferential statistics. I'm sympathetic with the idea that many of you have not had the statistics course, or just not really ready to, excuse me, I got lost, to delve into this in tremendous detail. But let me just get the take-home messages, irrespective of what these numbers say. An ANOVA is just an analysis of variance, which is a statistical technique to test for significant differences, statistically significant differences. So the first ANOVA revealed an effect of time. For each group, for everybody together, there were more details remembered at time 1 than time 2. We would expect that. 6 months elapsed. And for group, there were more details remembered by the positive and negative groups than the neutral group, which I would have expected. The people that just don't care are just not involved. They're going to remember less. My team didn't win and didn't lose. The ANOVA also showed an interaction between detail type and group, between detail type and time, and among detail type, time, and group. This three-way interaction showed that at time 2, event-related details were recalled marginally better than the negative group, than for the negative group, than by the positive group. In other words, the negative group, this is the bottom sentence of this slide, the negative group people were better at remembering event-related details, as was somewhat hypothesized at the very beginning. The suggestion is that when I have a very positive memory, the Red Sox coming back, maybe I'm lost in the bliss and don't remember the particulars. Conversely, if I'm a Yankees fan and my team lost, I remembering who struck out, who made an error, all the difficult aspects that contributed to my emotional plight. So if there's one thing that's interesting here, some of these things are obvious. For instance, that there are more details remembered at time 1 than time 2. But also, for event-related details, the negative group did better. They remember things that are more painful in greater detail. So with respect to consistency, an ANOVA with detail type, as a within subjects factor and group as a between subjects factor, etc. So the bottom line was, let's see if we can pull this apart here. The negative group, and this is right after the bracketed phrase, was most consistent. So the Yankees fans, the ones that really suffered and suffered a really shocking comeback, were the ones that were most consistent in their memories for the 6 months between, I don't know, roughly November and May, or October and April of 04 and 05. So they were the ones that had the greatest accuracy in terms of their consistency, which is kind of interesting. So one last slide. Confidence for event-related details was marginally higher for people that found it to be negative, whereas confidence in the accuracy of personal details was highest in participants who found it to be positive. And again, to continue to iterate, these are the Red Sox fans that found it positive. The negative group was the Yankees, in which they found it to be negative. So my confidence was higher when it was negative. I particularly remember negative things that happened, who struck out, and the confidence in the accuracy of the personal details, who I was sitting with, who I high-fived, who I was happiest with, etc. In that case, that belonged to the Red Sox fans. So a main effect of detail, personal details were more vivid than event-related details, was also found. In other words, for each group, as might be plausible, they just happen to remember more personal aspects of their game-watching experience than things related to the game. Those things are just easier to remember. Whom you were with, how cold it was outside, all sorts of things of that stripe. So that kind of makes sense. Okay, and I just want to wrap up one summary slide here. So in terms of the total number of details remembered, positive and negative valence had similar effects. Both of them outperformed the neutral group, people who weren't cheering for either team. Both valence groups, positive and negative, remembered a comparable number of details, and each group remembered significantly more details than the neutral group did. However, valence did influence the type of details recalled. This is from the discussion. Although positive and negative groups remembered an equal number of personal details, the negative group remembered more event-related details than did the positive group. This finding is consistent with prior evidence that negative emotions enhance memory for central details. In other words, I remember the particulars of President Kennedy's assassination. It was so painful. I remember that Walter Cronkite came on at 1 o'clock in the afternoon Central Time to inform the public that President Kennedy died, etc. Maybe a lot of things that people are of that age might remember if they were school age or older on November 22nd, 1963. So it goes for this particular outcome, which is less grave. No one died, of course, but nonetheless would have been acutely disappointing to Yankees fans. So it's a clever teasing apart of positive and negative valence, which had never been done to these lengths before. And to their enormous credit, these authors to pull themselves together to do such a thing right after such a major event was very enterprising. So, most notably, negative valence was associated with greater memory consistency than was positive or neutral valence. So, I rooted for the Yankees. They went down in flames and lost 4 straight games, and I remember just all kinds of particulars, and I'm irritated about it. However, the present results suggest that distortion can be lower for memories of negative events than those for positive ones. So, if I were a Red Sox fan, I might be prone to misleading myself about some of the things that happened during that particular athletic contest, sort of deluding myself out of the sheer bliss of the situation. So, of all the things that have happened to you, some acutely negative, but there are others that were just over the moon positive. And I often wonder what we take home with us as being a memory that really wasn't correct based on the emotion of the situation, particularly if it happened to be very positive. When I was a young kid, I was 12 years old and was not a very good athlete. But on one particular night in Little League, and I still can't believe this happened, almost 35 years later now, I actually hit a home run, and it went over the fence. And my parents and the neighbor lady and everybody else were just absolutely in a state of shock. And I think I remember some of the details from what happened. But on the other hand, after all this time, and it has been, that was 1982, I can't help but wonder if I've sort of misremembered a lot of that. There's no way to document it. It wasn't filmed, of course. So I'd be very curious to know how many of those things actually happened that I think happened, and people that said things and those sorts of things. Because it was, for a little kid at age 12 that wasn't very good, to do something like that was the most rapturous experience I think I'd ever had to that moment in my life. I never thought something like that could happen. Well, I want to also follow up with Garry and Gerrie, kind of an unusual combination of names. Also a deeply empirical study that sort of follows up on the suggestibility of memory based on a very important insinuation. In other words, a photograph that's injected into the situation that may cause people to believe something differently. So whether they are stories of individual lives or of society as a whole, important stories are often illustrated with photographs, which give the imprimatur of authenticity. An imprimatur is sort of like a stamp that's an official thing, a good thing. In this paper, we address that. So one phrase out there, it isn't trustworthy simply because it's a picture, a photographer said. It's trustworthy if someone we trust made it. So this is kind of harkens back, if you will, if you happen to look, and I hope you did, at the Elizabeth Loftus Bugs Bunny study. Very clever. I see a picture that suggests something happened, and I'm sold. So, to answer this question, these authors adapted the Loftus and Pickrell Lost in the Mall method, in which they suggested things to people based on photographs. And these photographs suggested things that happened but actually never did happen. I should mention, although the article did, I want to just touch on what the Lost in the Mall study was. This classic study from 1995, 21 years ago. The bottom line is that Loftus and Pickrell, and we'll read this later, recruited people and their family members and convinced these college students that they had been lost in a mall roughly 15 years prior as a 5-year-old. And at first, the people resisted. The college students resisted. And by the way, the importance of having recruited the family members is that the family assured Loftus that there had been no such incident that took place in a mall. So once they got that out of the way, and we knew that any memories of having been lost in a mall were false, we could proceed, and they did proceed. But then they continued to sort of, if you will, work on the young college-age participant. Do you remember the time that you were lost in the mall? Do you remember being found by an elderly man, etc.? And the college students initially resisted, but then some fraction of them essentially acquiesced and caved in and said, wow, that didn't ring a bell at first, but it's coming back to me now, as Celine Dion would say. Some details are starting to present themselves. Yeah, I remember the flannel shirt. I remember, the displays at J.C. Penney, what have you. All of these things that didn't happen nonetheless became ensconced as memories for that person. So anyway, the details, they decided that they could cement this even further with the use of photographs. And forgive me for reading, but there's a few critical things I want to mention here. The question was simply whether showing participants, subjects, a doctored photograph with no supporting narrative would lead them to remember a vivid false experience. They showed each subject, and again, I'm sorry for that word, 4 photos. We've retired the word subject, by the way. 3 were real childhood photos. Birthday party, swinging on the swing set, who knows. And 1 was fake, showing the subject taking a childhood hot air balloon ride. And again, they would have had to have cleared it with the family. Hey, this person never took a hot air balloon ride, did they? No. So we have to know that that would be a false memory. The doctored photos were created for each subject by using Photoshop and an assortment of real photos, of course. These people cut the subjects and at least one family member out of these additional photos and pasted them into a dummy photo of a hot air balloon ride. In other words, I manufactured a strong suggestion that this hot air balloon ride actually took place. Family members again verified that the ride never happened, which we would have to do. So for what it's worth, this is a heck of a deception, for crying out loud, to not only deceive the participant, but to recruit the participants' family members to participate in that deception. I gotta tell you, it's not unethical. It was approved by their IRBs, the institutional review boards. But I have to say, I wouldn't have wanted to get involved with such an elaborate deception. You never know how someone's going to react. After participants reviewed each photo 3 times over roughly 2 weeks, half remembered something about the ride. Often these reports were rich with detail, and at the end of the study, participants expressed genuine astonishment when they learned that the photo was fake. Is that interesting? So that's an interesting piece of background from Garry and Gerrie, which I find to be a clever setup for what they're going to do. So Garry and Wade combine the methods of Loftus and Pickrell and these ones that we just cited. Half the subjects saw a photograph of themselves taking a balloon ride, and the other half read a description of the same false event. So you either had a photograph or you didn't this time. To make sure that the description and the photo conveyed the same information, they went out of their way to ensure that. By interview 3, 80% of the participants who read a false narrative reported memories of the event, compared to only half who saw the false photo, and that would have been a significant difference. 80% who read the false narrative believed it, only half who saw the false photo. Moreover, when participants were asked whether photographs or narratives were better at jogging memories, there was an interesting interaction. Narrative subjects said that photos were better. Photo subjects said that the narratives were better. But it's an interesting, I guess you could say, takeaway message that the narrative was more powerful than the photo. An interesting expansion. And maybe the narrative offers more granular detail. Hard to say. Taken together, these studies suggest that photos alone are powerful enough to elicit false memories on their own, but that they're not necessarily more powerful than narratives. In fact, they're less powerful. I just said that. So if Wade et al. Hypothesized photographs do make it easier for people to imagine and then come to believe the false event depicted. So that concrete depiction may be paramount. So let's get on to what their method was and the particulars here. So it's some interesting details. While narratives allowed subjects to generate their own details about their balloons, the detail in the false photographs demanded that subjects generate details about the experimenter's balloon. That's interesting. Thus, the subjects who saw the photograph would have found it more difficult to produce information they later thought to be a real memory. So the irony is the photograph, while apparently powerful, delimits the degree of imagination you can attend to it, that you can attach to it. Whereas the narrative, on the other hand, allows you to develop your own narrative more, if you will. And maybe that's why there was such a stronger effect for having a narrative as opposed to a photograph. In either case, these studies required tremendous amount of deception, not just deceiving the participants, but also deceiving, having the family members aid in deceiving the participants. It's kind of a elaborate lengths to go to, but Loftus and Pickrell began this paradigm just 21 years ago, not that long really. So anyway, that may be the explanation. While the narratives allowed subjects to generate their own details about balloons, the details in the false photographs demanded that they generate the details about a balloon they could actually see, and it was more delimiting somehow. So concerns about these techniques led these authors to examine the effect, Hagen and all, of a real photograph to cultivate a false memory. Now that's interesting. What if I showed you a real photograph of something that happened in your life, taken from your 4th grade photo or what have you? Using a variation of the lost in the mall method, they asked participants to remember 3 experiences. 2 were real, 1 was false. The false event described the subject putting slime, and if you remember slime, you may be too young, was a gelatinous, jello-like green substance that left a little bit of a film on your fingers, but it was pretty much self-contained. I think it came in an egg. That was kind of gross, but it was a fun toy for a kid. Into the teacher's desk drawer. So the false memory is you put that in your teacher's desk drawer. So what were 2 true memories from maybe the 3rd grade? You won the spelling bee. You got stung by a bee at recess. Who knows? And then this 3rd thing that's not true about putting slime in the teacher's desk. All the subjects read a description of each event, and half also saw their real class photo to help them remember. So they saw themselves in pigtails on the basketball court having their class photo taken. While slightly fewer than half of the description-only participants developed mental images of the slime story, 70% of the people that happened to see their real 4th grade photo saw it. So in other words, just seeing a real photo somehow lent credence to the false narrative. These results show that even true photos can cause people to remember false events. So if I were going to dupe somebody into thinking that they did a misdeed in their early childhood, I might show them an actual photograph that sort of lets them place themselves in that context somehow. Fascinating findings, they really are. I like Garry and Gerrie because it's less empirical. They're not killing us with inferential stats as Kensinger and Schacter did, but nonetheless, Kensinger rather, and Schacter. But nonetheless, we have some very, very powerful take-home messages. So, again, one of the most interesting parts is that the narrative outperformed the photograph, but also that a true photograph can engender false memories. You take a photograph of somebody's past and tell them a story about something that happened around that time period. Seeing the photograph itself produces more false memories than not seeing that photograph, which is interesting. Schacter's 2001 Part 2 is very direct. I would hope that you would watch that video that has to do with Timothy McVeigh. The McVeigh situation is very sad. He was a domestic terrorist by any metric. He was aggrieved over Waco. He was aggrieved over a lot of perceived government insinuations into everyday life. And on April 19th, 95, 21 years ago, he parked a van full of fertilizer-based explosives near the Murrah building in Oklahoma City. It killed 168 people, including many, many, many children in a daycare that was in that building. So one of the things that became interesting as he told his story was a memory bias that would have been in his past. In other words, he told the story of how he got caught. Did he engage in egocentrism, etc.? So this part is very, very direct. Schacter, part 2. It has to do with the biases that we bring to bear when we're telling stories. So there are 5 major types of biases in which we may tell stories with that are going to interfere with good memories. Consistency and change biases show how our theories about ourselves can lead us to reconstruct the past as overly similar to or different from the present. Hindsight biases reveal that the recollections of past events are filtered by current knowledge. In other words, I could have seen that coming. I could have predicted that. Egocentric biases illustrate the powerful role of the self in orchestrating perceptions and memories of reality. One might argue, and I kind of would, that McVeigh engaged in an egocentric bias. He would tell you that he got caught on purpose, essentially. He was playing a game with law enforcement. By the way, as you'll see in the video, the way he got caught was leaving license plates off that old beater. And the cop, of course, pulled him over, and one thing led to another. So had he had plates on it, he might have beaten the charge altogether. And stereotypical biases demonstrate how generic memories shape interpretations of the world, even when we're unaware of their existence or influence. This passage from Schacter is very direct. I think you'll find it to be applicable to our current situation. And do let me know if you have any questions. So thank you for listening. I know these screencasts are long, but nonetheless, I think they're the best marriage that we can have between an online class and an in-person class. And they, I just can't imagine giving you all this work to do without some input from me that's meaningful. Well, thank you for listening, and I will see you at my next screencast.